Last time we spoke about the Wuchang uprising and the Xinhai Revolution. The revolutionary armies formed a massive assault, managing to seize Wuchang, Hanyang, and Hankou. However, the Qing dynasty had a card up their sleeve in the form of Yuan Shikai and his Beiyang army. Yuan Shikai defeated the rebel armies with ease, but when the time came to eradicate them for good, he held back. Instead, he plotted with the revolutionaries to coerce the emperor to abdicate in order for himself to be made president over the new republic. In a masterstroke, Yuan Shikai seized the presidency and immediately went to work consolidating his power. Through the use of political abuses, bribery, threats, and even assassination, Yuan Shikai was securing his control over the new republic. However, all of his actions were met with outrage from the public, and particularly from the KMT. Now Dr. Sun Yat-sen would unleash a second revolution to save the republic. This episode is A Great War and the Siege of Tsingtao. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I've just released part 3 of my General Kanji Ishiwara series, this one titled The China War. That series used to be an exclusive to my Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, you can find more than 14 plus ongoing exclusive Patreon podcasts and other goodies. And all of that comes as low as just $2 a month, so please check it out. When Yuan Shikai became provisional president, he was hailed by the Senate as, quote, "Of all the presidential elections in the world history, only George Washington enjoyed unanimous approval. Now you, Yuan, sir, have repeated Washington's record. To the world, you are the second Washington in this regard. To our republic in China, you are the first." Probably one of the most ridiculous statements ever made. And a few days later, Manchu elite troops, the Eight Banners, delivered Yuan Shikai a letter, which read, "The people in North China regard you as China's first Washington. The people from South China see you as the world's second Washington. There is no doubt how much the entire country adores you." They certainly had something going on with George Washington in China at this time. Now, the original abdication edict given to Yuan Shikai would read like this. Yuan Shikai holds the absolute authority along with the civilian army, Minjun, the South, to organize the provisional republican government and to discuss the approach for achieving the unification of the country. But Yuan Shikai revised the edict a bit. Yuan Shikai holds the absolute authority to organize the provisional republican government and discuss the approach for unifying the country along with the civilian army. Now, in early 1912, Dr. Sun Yat-sen had set 3 conditions for Yuan Shikai's assumption of the provisional presidency. Nanjing would be the national capital, as he would assume his presidency in Nanjing, and he would have to respect the provisional constitution. Now, as I had mentioned in the previous episode, Yuan Shikai performed a false flag operation to make sure that Beijing became the capital, where he and his Beiyang army had the strongest position. It is estimated in 1912 China had roughly 1 million soldiers. This was an enormous financial burden on the government and quite a threat to the regime, as many of these soldiers began to join cliques that were loyal to local warlords. When soldiers' pay is delayed, they tend to perform mutinies, thus Yuan Shikai demobilized them in late April of 1912. He sought to reduce the military to 500,000 in 50 divisions. He disbanded 16 divisions in Jiangsu, Anhui, Hunan, and Sichuan. Within Nanjing, he made sure that 100,000 troops under the command of Huang Xing were ordered to step down. By June of 1912, Nanjing's force would be a third its original size. Now, while the number of troops were reduced everywhere, this did not hinder his own Beiyang army, for they were an army of quality over quantity. It was the pro-KMT forces that would suffer the most, and this was, of course, intentional. To prevent local forces from becoming regional powers, Yuan Shikai began enforcing a policy of separating powers between military command and civilian administration in the provinces. Yet, as we mentioned in the last episode as well, Yuan Shikai weakened the other forces as he strengthened his own. He took foreign loans in secrecy, known infamously as the Shanhou Daijiguan, or in English, reorganization loan. The Chinese public were outraged at the humiliating situation, and the KMT were the most furious. In early May, General Li Quan led the 8th Division from Baoding to Wuhan, while also dispatching crack troops to reinforce Shanghai. On June the 9th, Yuan Shikai removed the pro-KMT governor of Jiangxi, Li Liejun, and replaced him with Vice President Li Yuanhong. On June the 13th, Yuan Shikai replaced the pro-KMT military governor of Guangdong, Hu Hanman, with Chen Qiongming. Then on June the 30th, the pro-KMT governor of Anhui, Bai Wenwei, was dismissed, and on that same day, Li Yuanhong performed a mass arrest of many party leaders in Wuhan. Yuan Shikai then dispatched the 6th Division under Li Quan into Jiangxi province on July the 3rd. It was pretty obvious to the KMT what was going on. All of the political maneuvering, coupled with the assassination of Song Jiaoren, prompted Dr. Sun Yat-sen to unleash a second revolution. On July the 12th, Li Liejun issued an anti-Yuan Shikai declaration which effectively began the second revolution. With this, Jiangxi claimed its independence. 3 days later, Huang Xing scrambled to Nanjing, where he organized an anti-Yuan Shikai force and announced Jiangsu independent. 2 days after this, the previous governor of Anhui, Bao Wenwei, declared his province independent. The next day, Chen Qimei announced Shanghai's independence. Then this was followed by Guangdong under Chen Jiangming. Then Fujian province claimed its independence. Of course, the KMT actions drew a quick response from Yuan Shikai. He had, of course, already preemptively moved his forces, as I had mentioned, to key locations where they would easily dominate their KMT opponents. Yuan Shikai had been given ample time and ample funding in 1913. Meanwhile, the revolutionary forces were quite divided, poorly organized, and poorly armed. They lacked the same fervor that had held them during the First Revolution. Yuan Shikai also used propaganda to demonize the KMT to justify his military campaigns. Yuan Shikai had accused Dr. Sun Yat-sen of revolutionary proclivity, meaning he only knew how to bring chaos and destruction. Yuan Shikai would also remark, Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Huang Xing have no real ability besides causing disturbances and bringing troubles. On July the 22nd, anti-Yuan forces were defeated around Xuzhou by the 2nd Division led by Feng Guozhang and Jian Xin. By the way, for those of you who know your Chinese warlord history, you're going to hear a lot of names that are very important later on. For example, I just named Feng Guozhang. For those of you who are interested in such things and you want to learn, in advance before this podcast covers such stuff, you can go over to my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, and go check out my rather long documentary on China's warlord era. I was not able to cover every single warlord or military leader as it is absolutely insane, but I would argue there is nobody else in all of YouTube who even tried to cover the amount that I did. The maps are a little bit outdated. I wasn't as good as animating back then when I made that stuff, but it's pretty good. And I put a lot of comedy in it, so if you like a little laughs on the side, I would say it's excellent. But back to the story. They fled to Nanjing, and from the 22nd to the 28th, rebel groups attacked the manufactural borough in Jiangnan. The Beiyang Navy came to help the army and repelled the attack. On the 30th, two forces led by Liang Qingwang and Li Yaohan joined up around Jiaoqing and advanced upon Sanshui district. The next day, a Beiyang force led by Ni Xichong attacked Fengtai. By the 2nd of August, Fengtai fell to the Beiyang forces. When Sichuan declared independence on August the 4th, Yuan Shikai ordered Yunnan's warlord, Tang Qiao, to attack the Sichuan rebels. On August the 5th, Beiyang forces attacked Shao country, and 2 days later, many Anhui forces deserted the revolutionaries to join Yuan Shikai, and on the 11th, the capital of Anqing was taken. That same day, Hu Haoming led 2,000 men to try and defend Nanjing against the Beiyang army, as Liang Qingwang seized Guangzhou. The next day, Hunan cancelled their independence movement as the Beiyang navy captured Wusang. On September the 1st, Nanjing fell, prompting Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Huang Xing, and Chen Qimei to flee to Japan. On September the 11th, Chongqing's defenders simply dispersed, and with that, the Second Revolution had completely collapsed. There were countless reasons as to why Yuan Shikai had won. The strength and disparity between his forces and the revolutionaries was quite vast. His army was well trained. The reorganization alone had greatly boosted them. The revolutionaries were very divided. There were certainly many vying for power. The general public were so tired of war and conflict by this point. They loathed the assassinations of Song Zhaoren, but they simply wanted peace. The national mood simply favored Yuan Shikai. Dr. Sun Yat-sen yet again went to work strengthening the KMT abroad. The foreign powers threw their support to Yuan Shikai's new government. Yuan Shikai now exacted all effort to eliminate revolutionaries with firm support from the Progressive Party. It's estimated 1,000 activists were killed and many more were arrested. The purge saw countless accused without fair trial, some not even a trial at all. Freedom of speech was stamped out, countless newspapers were ordered to be censored. Yuan Shikai's military victories during the Second Revolution saw him secure positions in Anhui, Jiangsu, Hunan, Guangdong, Fujian province. Though local forces persisted to be a problem, Yuan Shikai was dramatically centralizing power. After crushing the Second Revolution, Yuan Shikai passed the presidential election law on October the 5th of 1913. It is said at this point, Yuan Shikai resorted to using citizen corps to besiege Congress, harassing and threatening them into voting for him. I guess you can see some similarities with the brown shirts during the Weimar Republic and the rise of Adolf Hitler. In the first round, Yuan Shikai received 471 ballots, in the second, 497, but neither were enough. In the third round, he won 507, just enough to become president. He refused to take the oath in Congress and instead did a ceremony in the former imperial palace. Not a good look. He sat in the emperor's throne in his military uniform before he had a grand parade on the Tiananmen rostrum with 20,000 of his loyal troops. Again, not a very good look. Then Yuan Shikai dissolved Congress on January the 10th of 1914 because, quote, it lacked legitimate quorum due to the expulsion of nationalist legislators. It was not effectively organized, it was not operating efficiently or achieving much, and it was deliberately fostering nationwide chaos. And hear this. Yuan Shikai literally just gave all of them $400 and told them to go home. That's a special kind of funny level of corruption. After this, he ordered the suspension of all provincial assemblies and local autonomous organs. Yes, you know where this is going. He was making himself a dictator. He did create a political council called Zhongzhu Huiyi, but it was nothing more than an advisory body. On January the 26th, the political council convened a constitutional drafting conference. On March the 14th of 1914, the conference drafted the Constitution of the Republic of China, which Yuan Shikai proclaimed in effect as of May the 1st. Now, this new, air fingers quote, constitution gave Yuan Shikai paramount power to convene and shut down legislature. There were no clear lines drawn between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. Basically, Yuan Shikai controlled all three. Yet Yuan Shikai's authority all rested upon one thing, his military power. To assert control over the vast provinces of China, he had to promote military governors. These military governors would have civil authority and control over their own armies. And yes, for those of you who know the next period of Chinese history, the warlord period, it is being born with this. Yet, while the beginnings of the warlord era were just approaching, something else very important was approaching in the year of 1914. World War I began at a time when China was in complete disarray. China was militarily weak, in financial chaos, and very unstable politically. Yuan Shikai attempted keeping China neutral during the war, but the war came to her door nonetheless. On August 6th of 1914, China proclaimed its neutrality and prohibited warring states from undertaking any military actions on her soil. It's kind of like having PTSD over the Russo-Japanese War. However, with so many different world powers holding concessions on her territory, well, something was going to happen one way or another. By the way, what I'm about to talk about is known as the Siege of Tsingtao. It's actually an incredible historic event. Multiple firsts in history occur here. It's one of my favorite battles of World War I, and not many people even know about it in the West. Stating all of that, if you want a more visual experience of this battle, you can go over to my YouTube channel, the Pacific War Channel. I am sorry for continuously doing this, but I do have an episode on the Siege of Tsingtao, and it's pretty cool. Also, I don't know when it'll come out, and I hope I'm not spoiling anything, but I did write a script for the Siege of Tsingtao for Kings and Generals, and in the future they will be doing a YouTube episode on it, and I'm quite excited for that. Now, going back in time somewhat, in 1902, Britain and Japan signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. Because of this, when World War I broke out, the alliance basically encouraged the Japanese Empire to enter the war on the side of Britain for mutual defense. At the outbreak of the war, Britain feared the German East Asiatic Squadron would raid her merchant shipping and planned to run the Germans out by destroying their bases and communications. I hate to do this, but if you want to learn more about the honestly courageous and badass German raiders of the Pacific during World War I, again, check out my Pacific War channel. I particularly liked making the episode on the German raiders. Now, within the first week of the war, Britain requested assistance from Japan to just identify German shipping. I must emphasize the word assistance. Britain in no way wanted Japan to start attacking and seizing German colonial possessions in China or in the Asia-Pacific. You see, the German Empire held numerous islands out in the Pacific, and notably the port city of Tsingtao, current-day Qingdao. Yes, it's the same place that makes the delicious beer. Honestly, a personal favorite of mine. Well, in the face of an extremely weak German presence in the Pacific, all of these goodies were just kind of lying around, and the Japanese Empire was not going to let the opportunity slip by. Japan, of course, was an empire, and she held larger ambitions in the Asia-Pacific, so she instead offered to enter the war and join the Entente. Britain did not want this in any way, but the German raiders were causing absolute havoc upon her and Anzac shipping, so she reluctantly accepted this, but privately warned Japan not to seize German islands in the South Pacific, because she desired them to be taken by Australia and New Zealand. Stating all of that, Japan's war aims were first to capture the German base at Tsingtao, and then the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands, and secondly, to hunt down the East Asiatic Squadron. On August 15th, Japan issued an ultimatum to Germany demanding her warships withdraw from Chinese and Japanese waters and transfer control of Tsingtao to Japan. When the ultimatum expired on the 23rd, Japan officially declared war on Germany. Now, the Germans hoped their garrison would be able to hold out until the war in Europe was won and done, so they instructed the governor of the leased territory of Jiaozhou, Alfred Mayer-Waldeck, to defend Tsingtao to the last. Kaiser Wilhelm II's exact words to Admiral Alfred Mayer-Waldeck were, "It would shame me more to surrender Tsingtao to the Japanese than Berlin to the Russians." And yes, this was the good old Kaiser being a racist asshole again. When the war broke out, most of the warships of the East Asia Squadron, led by Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, were dispersed across the Pacific. I can't talk about it in this episode, but like I said, go check out my German Raiders episode on the YouTube channel. Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee was an absolute badass. Mayor Waldeck assembled all the available warships he could: the torpedo boat S-90, unprotected cruiser Cameron, auxiliary cruiser Cameron to make things more confusing, steamer Ryazan, gunboats Lux, Tiger, Jaguar, Iltis, and the Austro-Hungarian protected cruiser Kaiserin Elizabeth. Obviously, Tsingtao's warships would be absolutely dwarfed by the Imperial Japanese Navy, who dispatched the 2nd Squadron under Vice Admiral Sadakichi Kato on August the 27th, supported by some British warships. Tsingtao's defenses consisted of the port, the town, and 3 defensive lines, the first extending from the Kaiserstuhl to the Listuner Heights. The second line of defense lay across the steep hills from Prinz Heinrich and to the Kushan. The third line consisted of 3 fortified hills, Mount Mocha, Mount Bismarck, and Mount Iltis, each equipped with guns of various caliber. For example, Mount Mocha had 2 240mm guns, Fort Bismarck had 4 280mm howitzers, and Fort Iltis had 2 240mm guns. Tsingtao's town, seaward, and landward defenses were 4 batteries and 5 redoubts. Mayor Waldeck had at his disposal 1,300 Marines of the 3rd Sea Battalion, 350 naval gunners, 180 naval personnel staff, 400 sailors, 1,500 reservists, and 100 Chinese policemen, totaling nearly 4,000 men. They had altogether about 90 guns of various calibers, 120 machine guns, 28 automobiles, and 2 Etrechtaba aircraft. By the way, this is 1914, the very early days of World War I, and the aircraft literally look like something Leonardo da Vinci would have sketched. I really do recommend looking it up. They're pretty interesting. You have to imagine yourself fighting in one. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is China doing during all of this? Since they did proclaim neutrality and demanded that other nations not fight on their soil. Well, just like with the Russo-Japanese War, China yet again took the humiliation. The Chinese government initially protested against the Japanese warfare on her soil against the Germans. However, given Japan simply did not care, Yuan Shikai begrudgingly had no choice but to permit the Japanese encroachment against Qingdao. The battle for Tsingtao would be the only acts of war on Chinese soil during the First World War. On August the 22nd, the SMS Liaoting and the S-90 were attacked by the KMS Kennett, led by Lieutenant Commander F.A. Russell of the China Squadron. The Germans raced back to port with the S-90 scoring 2 hits on the Kennett before she peeled off when Tsingtao's 4-inch shore battery began to fire upon her. Then on the 27th, the IJN's 2nd Squadron, led by Vice Admiral Sadakichi Kato, began a naval blockade of Jiaozhou. The fleet quickly seized 3 coastal islands and began minesweeping operations. On the 30th, a storm drove the IJN destroyer Shirotaye aground on a coastal island, allowing the HMS Jaguar to surge out of port and destroy her. On September the 2nd, the Japanese began landing 23 soldiers of Major General Mitsumo Kamio's 18th Infantry Division, along with 142 pieces of artillery. They fanned the area, finding no enemy north of the Paisha River. The region was experiencing terrible flooding, making it a muddy nightmare. It was at this point the local Chinese protested the breach of neutrality, but offered no real opposition. By the 7th, an advance guard was riding to Tsingtao, and meanwhile, the British were quite suspicious of the Japanese intentions. Perhaps they thought that they were going to seize all of Shandong province. So they dispatched a symbolic force of 1,500 men led by Brigadier General Nathan Walter Bardenston from Tianjin. They would be followed up by 500 men of the 36th Sikhs. Now, Mayor Waldeck responded to the landings by withdrawing his forces to the 2 inner defensive lines. On the 5th, the IJN carrier Wakamiya launched a far-mine seaplane that scouted the port and town. The pilot reported the East Asiatic Squadron was absent, prompting the IJN to dispatch 2 fast squadrons to hunt them down. The next day, the Wakamiya launched another fireman, who unsuccessfully attacked the Jaguar and Kaiser Elizabeth in Jiaozhou Bay with bomblets. This would be the second air-to-sea battle to occur in history. The first occurred during the Balkan Wars in 1913. In response, both cruisers had guns removed from them, added to the land defenses, establishing Battery Elizabeth. On the 13th, Japanese cavalry ran into a German outpost at Jimo, causing them to flee after a short skirmish. The Japanese seized the small town of Jiaozhou and on the 14th cut the Shandong Railway. You really have to imagine how pathetic the Chinese government looked during all of this. Now the weather conditions were abysmal. The flooding and mud was so terrible, Kamio knew it would take weeks to move his entire division over the peninsula, so instead he took a calculated risk. Kamio ordered his 24th Infantry Brigade, whom were just landing ashore at the time, to re-embark as his cavalry, engineers, and 23rd Infantry Brigade continued their advance to Jimo, thus abandoning the bridgehead. Kamio ordered the rest of his forces to land in Laoshao Bay. On the 17th, the Japanese attacked Wankohang, 13 miles from Jimo, causing the Germans to withdraw from the town during the night. The next day, the Japanese arrived at Jimo, exhausted and nearly starving, as the IJN cruisers bombarded the empty beaches of Laoshao Bay, allowing the 23rd Infantry Brigade to land. With Jimo secured, Kamio ordered his forces to seize the Hotong Pass, driving back another small German outpost. After a cavalry company of the 24th Brigade made contact with the forces at Jimo, Tsingtao was now effectively surrounded. On the 19th, the Japanese seized the Meckelberg House, a mountain spa, and broke through the outermost defensive line. Kamio now figured the Germans would only mount a defense within the city's fortifications, so he ordered his forces to close in, causing the German patrols to withdraw further inwards. Because of the terrible terrain conditions, the Japanese began constructing piers at Laoshan and an airfield at Jimo. On the 21st, the Imperial Japanese Army launched 4 Farmans from Jimo to survey, bomb, and if possible, shoot down German aircraft. In late September, Japanese Farmans would perform the first nighttime bombing raid in history. Over on the other side, the Germans had accidentally crashed one of their tabes, leaving only one to be operated by the legendary pilot Lieutenant Gunther Pluschow. Pluschow performed daily reconnaissance flights and attempted to bomb Entente vessels. Pluschow would become the first aviator in history to be fired upon and receive damage by flak from naval ships. In late September, according to Pluschow, he ran into a Farman performing reconnaissance over at Tsingtao Harbor, and he claims he shot the pilot with his pistol, causing the aircraft to crash. If this is true, this would be the first aerial victory, or the first overclaiming aerial victory in history. Again, the Siege of Tsingtao is full of many historical firsts, yet, honestly, hardly anybody has heard about this event in the West. Mayor Waldeck realized the Japanese were maneuvering past the mountain line unmolested, so he ordered a counterattack as his artillery began firing up 1,500 shells upon the incoming enemy per day. On the 25th, a German force of 130 men, 2 field guns, and 4 machine guns raided an outpost at the Kletter Pass. The Japanese stood their ground and forced the Germans back. Meanwhile, the British began landing at Laoshao Bay. On the 26th, Kamio ordered a general advance, causing the Germans to completely pull back to their second line of defense. The Japanese crossed the river Pashao early in the day, swiftly crossing the 7-mile lowland plain and reached the northern bank of Yat-sen. To help with their withdrawal, the Jaguar and 690 came up to the harbor side and bombarded the Japanese right flank. The outer mountain outposts fell one by one, nearly bloodlessly. The Kaiser Elizabeth, Jaguar, and S-90 continued to shell the harbor flank, prompting Kamio to assign a field battery to engage them. The German ships managed to destroy an observation post and neutralize the battery. Kamio then requested Vice Admiral Kato begin a bombardment of the German land batteries to cover his advance. But Kato instead bombarded the German sea batteries. Here we see an emergence of the infamous inter-service rivalry between the IGA and the IGN. It was just blossoming. Mayor Waldeck knew that they would soon have to abandon the second line of defense, so he ordered his engineers to prepare a small outpost on the crest of Prince Heinrich Hill. They connected a telephone and a heliograph to its heavy land batteries, and 60 men with 4 machine guns manned the outpost with provisions for a 2-month siege. On the night of the 27th, Kamio ordered the 46th Infantry Regiment, reinforced with an engineer platoon, to scale the hill right in the middle of a typhoon. The men reached the crest by dawn, but were quickly pinned down by German machine gun fire. The Japanese charged the outpost numerous times, receiving heavy casualties, until the German CO decided to negotiate with them. He offered to surrender the peak if the Japanese would allow him and his men to withdraw back to Tsingtao. The Japanese commander simply refused and seized the CO by force. The Germans surrendered after suffering 6 deaths with 54 men captured. The Japanese would suffer 24 deaths with 150 wounded. Meanwhile, the Kaiser Elizabeth, Leopard, and S-90 continued to shell the Japanese right flank, prompting the IJN and the IJA field artillery to counterfire. On the 28th, the Japanese were closing in on the German inner defensive line, as their engineers began constructing a concrete platform upon Prince Heinrich Hill for a heavy artillery deployment. Mayor Waldeck ordered the land batteries and Pluschow to hit the Japanese rear. That same day, Cormoran, Iltis, and Lux were scuttled lest they become prizes of war. On October the 2nd, 3 German companies performed a night raid against the Japanese right flank. It quickly fell apart, seeing 29 Germans killed and 6 captured. The Japanese began digging trenches just a kilometer away from the German line as the British finally advanced to the front lines. A large issue began where the Japanese had a difficult time with friendly fire, as they could not tell the British and Germans apart. It's kind of funny if you ask me. To remedy this, the British were given Japanese overcoats to distinguish them from the Germans. On the 6th and 10th, Entente blockading ships dueled with Tsingtao's coastal batteries, but were driven off. On the 14th, the entire fleet performed a massive bombardment, seeing HMS Triumph take some light damage in the process. On the 15th, flash floods drowned 25 Japanese within their trench work, showcasing just how terrible the typhoon weather was. On the 17th, Mayor Waldeck ordered the S-90 to attempt an escape. The S-90 slipped out of the harbor during the night but ran straight into the IJN cruiser Takachiho. The S-90 fired a torpedo, detonating her magazine, sinking the cruiser, and claiming the lives of over 256 men. Then the S-90 attempted to flee, but would be interned at a Qing port further down the coast. On the 21st, the 36th Sikh landed at Lachan Bay. On the 22nd, Mayor Waldeck ordered another raid, seeing 80 Germans creep towards the Japanese trenches, only to be turned back when the sentries opened fire. By the 25th, the IJ artillery were now all in position, each with 15 days' worth of ammunition. Camus ordered them all to fire 80 shells per day, beginning on the 31st. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers formed special platoons using rifle grenades and bamboo tubes filled with explosives. Many lessons had been learnt during the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese saping and trench warfare was quite advanced for 1914 standards. The Entente fleet drew in closer, and on October the 31st, the birthday of Emperor Taisho, 100 field guns and naval guns were fired in a mass bombardment directed by balloons, farmans, and an observation post atop Prince Heinrich Hill. It was truly a very advanced battle, showcasing how much war had changed at the turn of the century. The first day of bombardment destroyed Tsingtao's land batteries, and Sabres drew 300 meters forward. The redoubts were particularly hit hard by artillery, and to the left of the German line, where 100 Chinese in the village of Taotongqian were unfortunately caught in the shell fire. Yet again, just like with the Russo-Japanese War, little attention was paid to the Chinese civilian victims. The next day, Mayor Waldeck had Kaiserin Elizabeth and Jaguar scuttled as their crews joined the garrisons atop the land. After Tsingtao's land batteries were neutralized, the Japanese bombardment targeted redoubts and barbed wire fields. On November the 2nd, the Sabres advanced another 300 meters. On the 3rd, redoubts were systematically pulverized, barbed wire was flattened, and the Tsingtao power station was obliterated. By the 4th, the Japanese had a full parallel assault line dug, and at dawn, Japanese infantry and engineering platoons assaulted the water pumping station. They seized the station, capturing 21 prisoners. Now Tsingtao had no well water. Basically, she was doomed. That same night, the Japanese Sabres advanced another 300 meters, while their British counterparts holding a rather difficult section of the line failed to keep up with them. The British had suffered 26 casualties from small arms fire. On the 5th, the Entente fleet closed in to point-blank range, and the IJN Suwo destroyed the Huixian Hook, killing 8 men and that of the last sea battery. Barbed wire lay crushed, redoubts pulverized or abandoned, and Tsingtao lay defensiveless by land or sea. On the night of the 6th, the Japanese dug their final assault line running between 100 to 1,000 meters in front of the German trenches. On the 6th, Mayor Waldeck knew it was the end, and he ordered Pluschow to fly his final dispatches back to Berlin. Now, you have to realize this is 1914. Saying you are going to fly back to Berlin from Tsingtao is quite a feat. Pluschow would fly 250 kilometers before crash landing in a rice paddy. He then burned his tabe and began advancing on foot. Pluschow would walk all the way to Daoshow, where some locals erected a party for him. He managed to obtain a pass to cross China as well as a junk to sail down the river to Nanjing. Pluschow felt he was being watched, so he assumed he would be arrested at any moment, so he leapt aboard a rickshaw and traveled to the local railway station. There he bribed a guard and he slipped aboard a train to Shanghai. At Shanghai, Pluschow met up with a friend who provided him with documents as a Swiss national, as well as some money and a ticket on a ship sailing for Nagasaki, then Honolulu, and finally to San Francisco. In January of 1915, he crossed the United States to New York City. He was reluctant to approach the German consulate there, as he had entered the country under a false identity. Even worse, he read in a newspaper that he was presumed to be in New York. Luck favored him again, however. This time he met up with a friend from Berlin who managed to get him travel documents for a ship that sailed on January the 30th of 1915 for Italy. After crossing the Atlantic Ocean, Pluschow's ship docked at Gibraltar, where the British arrested him as an enemy alien. You have to imagine their amazement that they discovered the infamous Aviator of Tsingtao in Gibraltar. Now, you would think that would be the end to his already incredible journey, but no. On May the 1st of 1915, Pluschow was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Donington Hall in Leicestershire. On July the 4th of 1915, he escaped during a storm and he headed for London. Scotland Yard began hunting him down, issuing an alert, asking the public to be on the lookout for a man with a, quote, dragon tattoo on his arm. Pluschow then disguised himself as a worker, and he felt safe enough to take a souvenir photograph of himself at the London docks. He occupied his time by reading books about Patagonia, and he also visited the British Museum. Now, this was wartime, so there were no notices published announcing the departure of ships. But by observing the riverway, Pluschow saw the ferry Princess Juliana sailing for the neutral Netherlands, and he managed to sneak aboard. He arrived safely and finally reached Germany, where he was at first arrested as a spy, since no one could possibly believe he could have accomplished such an incredible journey. Pluschow became the only German combatant during either World War to have successfully escaped from a prison camp in the British Isles. Once he was identified, Pluschow was acclaimed as, quote, the hero from Tsingtao. He was decorated, promoted, and assigned command of the naval base at Libau, in occupied Latvian Courland. In June of 1916, in an airplane hangar at Libau, Pluschow got married. There he wrote his first book, The Adventures of the Aviator from Tsingtao. It would sell more than 700,000 copies. And no shit, that was an incredible story. I could probably do an entire podcast on the story of Pluschow. And he has a very, very sad fate, as he will have a major crash landing over Patagonia, a place where he had always dreamed of flying, a very dangerous place to fly, by the way. But back to the Siege of Tsingtao. Camille gave the British sappers time to dig their approach next to his parallel lines, as his units probed the German lines for weak points. A Japanese company led by Major General Yoshimi Yamada, the commander of the 24th Infantry Brigade, assaulted Redoubt No. 4, causing the Germans to launch a bayonet charge, pushing them back. Mayor Waldeck ordered reinforcements to quickly head over to Redoubt No. 4, but before they arrived, a second Japanese company surrounded the redoubt, forcing their surrender. Over 200 prisoners were seized, and the Rising Sun flag was hoisted. The German reinforcements arrived to the scene and performed a counterattack, but they were crushed rather quickly. Meanwhile, the Japanese stormed redoubt number 3, surrounding and firing into its loopholes and cracks until the Germans surrendered as well. A local German reserve force launched a counterattack, overwhelming a Japanese flank outpost before the main force crashed down upon them. Japanese platoons then spread out along the trench lines. Redoubt number 2 was attacked from both flanks and the rear, falling rather quickly. Within 3 hours of battle, numerous courageous bayonet charges from both sides were launched, as all the redoubts were stormed and captured, excluding redoubts number 1 and 5, who held out desperately. Kemio then ordered the general assault to begin as the Japanese forces charged through a gap in the German central line. At 5:10 a.m. on the 7th, the North Battery at Chaotan Hill was captured. Half an hour later, the East Battery at Taotung-hin and Fort Chongqiwa, the base for the German right wing, were seized. As the Japanese surged forward, a company stormed up Iltis Hill. Searchlights poured down upon them, and soon the Japanese wielding bayonets and katanas charged into the Germans, fighting into hand-to-hand combat. 2 opposing officers dueled katana against German dress sword, seeing the Japanese officer cut down his opponent. After this, the Germans upon Iltis Hill surrendered. It must have been quite a scene seeing these 2 officers fight, by the way. Again, I don't know if a movie has ever been made about this event, but one should certainly be made. It would be very interesting. Another company stormed Bismarck Hill, seeing a quick surrender as men atop Iltis cheered. Mayor Waldeck knew it was all but over, and seeking to save further lives, he ordered Major von Kaiser with a small force to march out of Redoubt 1 and 5 waving white flags. On the morning of the 7th, which ironically was a beautiful day for once, Japanese and British troops entered Tsingtao with shouts of Banzai. It is said, as the Japanese troops entered the city, the Germans looked on with curiosity upon them, but when they saw the British behind them, the Germans turned their backs and spat in contempt. The Japanese had suffered 733 deaths, 1,282 wounded. For the British, it was 12 deaths with 53 wounded. The Germans had suffered 199 deaths and 504 wounded, and 98 Chinese civilians were killed, with 30 wounded, and countless incidents of rape against Chinese women by Japanese soldiers were reported. And I do have to say, it's impossible to gauge a number for exactly how many were. Again, no one cared. It is also said both the Germans and Japanese simply abused any of their Chinese laborers that they had hired during the event. A memorial service was held in Tsingtao as the Germans buried their dead. And now a rather famous part of the story occurs. 4,700 Germans were taken prisoner. They were sent to POW camps in Japan, and they were famously treated very well until 1919. The experience of these German prisoners in Japan would actually contribute to the alliance that we will see in World War II. The Japanese, similar to the Russo-Japanese War and how they were putting up this kind of public image front, that they were treating the Russians with the utmost of care, which they were, to be honest, well, they went overboard with the Germans. And it's easy to see evidence of this, as 170 of the German prisoners would remain in Japan having found wives or new lives. A large group of German military band members would actually tour all of Japan, playing classical songs to Japanese audiences, and they were beloved. And I have to mention this, of course, for to this day, there still remains a German influence in Qingdao. The old brewery in Qingdao still produces the pre-war style German beer titled Tsingtao. The brewery would survive World War I, the interwar period, or better said, the Chinese warlord era period, World War II, and the communist takeover. And it's a very good beer, if you never had it. And stating all of that, of course, this entire event was yet again another brutal humiliation against China. And unfortunately, it was just the start to such tremendous abuses during the Great War for China. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history content, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. If you like that story about the Siege of Tsingtao, I have an episode dedicated to the Siege of Tsingtao. But more importantly, I have an entire documentary about Asia during World War I. It's one of my more famous videos, and it's quite good. The maps are a little bit outdated as it is an older episode at this point. With that documentary, you get to learn about the experiences of China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and even the German raiders in the Pacific. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where I have more than 14 plus ongoing exclusive Patreon podcasts. This month's podcast is a two-parter on the entire history of the USS Enterprise, the most famous United States carrier in history. Please go check it out. Yuan Shikai was now the de facto dictator, or better said, the father of warlords over China. World War I was not something China wanted to be part of, but they would have absolutely no choice when the war literally came to their door. Japan was the first to start encroaching, and they were nowhere near done.